Friends, on October 31st, Ukraine destroyed one of the Oreshnik complexes in Kapustin Yar. This operation with Buygur actually took place last summer and was kept secret. The complex was completely destroyed. At that time, Russia didn't even know it had lost it. Moscow is experiencing its first real blackout. Thousands of Muscovites are without electricity, water, and heating. Elevators stopped, equipment burned out, communication was lost. The third blackout in 24 hours. People are charging their phones in their cars. At night, a series of strikes hit the CHP plants and oil refineries in Oryol, Vladimir, and Yaroslavl. Substations and a fuel oil storage facility were damaged. Partial blackout. No water, no heat, no electricity. More than 200 drones attacked Russia in a single night. And this is already the fifth night that the armed forces of Ukraine have attacked Moscow. Russia's power system is cracking, and for the first time, Moscow is in darkness. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetlan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health. Gennady.
Nikolevich here. The head of the SBU, General Maliuk, made a statement that Ukraine destroyed the Oreshnik complex in Kapustin Yar. This happened last summer. What do you say?
Our special services were working, as I understand it, to destroy Russian strike assets whenever possible. And we're talking about assets at the level of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The thing is, the Oreshnik was pushed to a range of 5,800 kilometers. In other words, one of the launches reached 5,800 kilometers. They managed to bring it into the category of intercontinental ballistic missiles, although, of course, it is actually a medium-range missile. But since at that time the so-called Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was in effect, they added 300 kilometers to its range, and it was classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile. Naturally, our special services destroyed precisely the ICBMs. Why? In principle, this entire operation was classified and remained so for a certain period of time. At least even Trump has already, at the very least, initiated an escalation regarding the use of nuclear weapons, that is specifically in terms of testing or, for example, restarting those same test sites, and that will be unambiguous. He has practically lifted the ban on work with intercontinental ballistic systems of various types, including, for example, Oreshnik. That's probably why this information has only just been revealed now. Why? Because after all, strikes on intercontinental nuclear delivery systems are quite a significant event. That's why our special services kept quiet about it at the time, and naturally, so did the Russians. They knew exactly what they had lost, that's for sure. The question is, how was this Oreshnik destroyed? What were the mechanisms? It could have been a well-executed sabotage and reconnaissance operation. For example, smuggling explosives into one of the missile's component nodes, and then, during pre-production testing at launch, it simply exploded. The Russians perceived it as, say, a technological explosion, but in reality, it was a detonation, for example, the work of our special services. Now, after some time has passed, most likely the people who were involved in this matter, that is in this kind of operation, have been taken out of harm's way, at the very least. And after that, of course, it was possible to boast about it. So, by the way, a big thank you to our special services who still make such actions public. Why? Because right now we need victories. We need a sufficient amount of them in the information space. At the very least, we need a stream of victorious or at least positive information. We need to restructure, to shift the flow of information away from defeatist and capitulationist narratives, which for the past several years have practically dominated Ukrainian society. They tried to convince us Ukrainians, they tried to convince the Cossacks that we wouldn't be able to reclaim our territories, that is to restore the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state. Yes, this kind of information is truly victorious news. It makes it possible to shift the narrative in the information space, to take a different direction, specifically a victorious one. This mechanism exists. It is possible to defeat Russia, yes, because at one time the Soviet Union was dismantled. Yes, it's the same situation. There's no need to invent anything new. The Russian Empire can also be dismantled. In the end, to open up this prison of nations, to break it apart, to free the peoples who are now practically being used as colonies by the Moscow metropolis.
Roman Igorovich, to wrap up with the Oreshnik topic, we started with blackouts in Russia, strikes on thermal power plants. Russians still have the ability to use up to 6 Oreshnik launches, Zelensky stated. The Russians do not want to deploy the Oreshnik in Belarus, and we know its estimated range is 5,000 kilometers. So Europeans need to pay attention to this, he noted. What do you think?
The issue lies in the production of the Oreshnik. Based on its technical specifications, it most likely depends on a certain technological chain, which would not allow for the production of more than a dozen missiles per year. Realistically, of course, it's one per quarter because they probably won't be able to produce more than 4 to 5 missiles a year. This isn't insider information, it's purely analytical. Therefore, with the ability to produce roughly 5 missiles a year, the Russians should have at least half a dozen of these missiles to carry out various tasks. The range allows for it, I'll repeat, it's at the limit. That is, the range of this missile is 5,500 to 5,800 kilometers, which is right at the threshold between a medium-range missile and an intercontinental ballistic missile. Even from Kapustin Yar, if they launch it from there, which is mainly where its base is located, they can cover almost all of Europe. So in this sense, that's exactly what we're talking about. Obviously, this is something that needs attention. The question is, most likely, this has already been noticed a long time ago. Why? At the moment, Kapustin Yar is within the radar coverage of the Aegis system. NATO has a good system. Aegis is an anti-missile system. And the SM-3 missile, which was recently put on combat duty, is an interceptor missile. It can intercept ballistic missiles at a range of up to 2,500 kilometers during their boost phase. They can reach Kapustin Yar. So as soon as this missile is launched without authorization, the so-called unauthorized launch, what does unauthorized mean? Every medium-range or intercontinental ballistic missile launch must be reported to the opposing side. In other words, roughly speaking, the Russians have to notify NATO, for example, that they are launching a missile, an intercontinental or medium-range missile. This is so that no one shoots it down, at least if these are pre-production tests or some other kinds of tests. Because if there is no such notification, a missile that could be launched without warning would simply be shot down right at launch. That is on the ascending trajectory, while it hasn't gained speed yet, while they're still trying to accelerate it and launch it into space. So at launch, the SM-3 missile will shoot it down. Therefore, this possibility exists. At least the Aegis system provides it. The radars that are located closer to Russia, take, for example, the Turkish radars. The Turkish radar, part of the Aegis system, can see almost as far as the Urals. So detecting it is not a problem. Well, as for the missiles that are now placed in silo launchers on land, these are actually sea-based silos, the Mk-41 launchers. They are now embedded in concrete in the ground. In Romania and in Poland, in Redzikovo, they can also reach. A ground-launched SM-3 missile can reach Kapustin Yar from Romania. And as for the ships, that the main base is actually the Mk-41 ships. That's exactly where they are located. In principle, a ship can enter the Black Sea and carry out exactly the same mission. So in this sense, Europe is covered, but it's covered by a certain number of, let's say, surface-to-air missile systems, by the same Aegis system in this case. Nevertheless, we need to pay attention to these kinds of capabilities the Russians have, especially with so-called mirrored warheads. There are several rods. At the very least, this is a kinetic missile with a kinetic impact. It needs to be shot down either at launch during its ascending trajectory or intercepted somewhere at altitudes of 1 to 1,500 kilometers in space. This is exactly what the SM-3 missile can also do up to. The moment the warhead separates.
Roman Igorovich, this is an important topic. Moscow without electricity, water, or heat. Nighttime strikes on the TCNPP, Oryol, Vladimir, Yaroslavl, everything burning. Russia is entering an energy collapse. Let's start with Moscow. The first real blackout in Moscow. In the Imperial residential complex near Moscow and in thousands of other places, people are left without electricity, without water, without heating. The electricity went out in all the buildings, elevators stopped working, families with children are leaving their apartments. Residents say this is already the third blackout in 24 hours, appliances have burned out, and there is almost no connection. To make a phone call, we have to go out to the highway. What is your reaction to this information?
Muscovites or maybe women from Moscow might actually feel okay about it. At least they have something working when it comes to elevators. But in reality, the groundwork for this was laid 3 months ago. It all started in August, at the beginning of August, when efforts to destroy the Russian economy began. Moreover, the optimal way to destroy the Russian economy is to start with the oil and gas sector, then move on to petrochemicals, and finally to energy. And now it's the energy sector's turn. For about a month now, we've been working only on the technological corridors that supply energy to Moscow and the Moscow region. There are 8 of them. Most of them come in from the southeast, mainly from the southeast. That's why the work is focused in that direction. At least for now, the main focus is on almost a dozen stations, power plants that either boost the energy supply or serve as transfer points, channeling electricity through themselves. From east to west and back again, depending on the voltage peaks. And they create, that is, they provide these very energy and technological corridors toward Moscow. If at least half of them are knocked out, say 4 out of 8, then Moscow will have a serious problem. Yes, they have emergency so-called power generation there. It's mostly gas powered. But if you also get to the gas pumping stations, that is, if you completely shut down the gas pumping and power supply, then all of Moscow will come to a halt, much to the delight of Muscovites.
Roman Grigorievich, are we right in understanding that this didn't happen without the actions of concerned individuals?
Well, absolutely. This is the work of our special services. First of all, in terms of providing intelligence, additional reconnaissance, and fire adjustment, that's for sure. That's the first thing. And second, directly, the confidants of our special services, those same concerned individuals, partisans, local resistance, they had a hand in carrying out this task when the task is clear, when it is defined. And it was defined by the work of our long-range strike capabilities. That is, we targeted the energy sector. Naturally, the concerned individuals got involved. They don't even need to be given the task directly. They understood what now. At the moment, the pressure is specifically on the energy sector that supplies Moscow and the Moscow region. In other words, it's one of the main objectives. To shut down Moscow, the decision-making center. And Moscow is a military target for us. Why is that? Because in Moscow and the Moscow region, at least a third of Russia's high-tech military production is located. The nodes and units that are produced are located precisely in Moscow and the Moscow region. That's one point. Second, starting from technological centers, from design bureaus to developers, yes, even nuclear facilities, nuclear research facilities in Dubna, remember, that's near Moscow. So essentially, for us, this is an important military cluster targeted for destruction. All the more so because Moscow is a metropolis. What is Russia? What is the Russian Federation? Yes, these are colonies that feed the metropolis, Moscow. Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, Ishkeria, Dagestan, as well, Buryatia, Yakutia. These are all colonies that inflict, they carry, so to speak, the spoils in their beaks to Moscow, the resources they dig up from their own land. And then Muscovites, of course, sell all of this on foreign markets. And somehow, at least for now, they share a little bit with these poor regions. But in reality, these are peoples, these are ethnic groups, these are republics, these are already state entities that should become the main ones, that is, the nation-forming territories. But for that to happen, you need to turn off the lights in Moscow, like turning off the lights in a bathhouse. And then we'll see what to do with what's left of Moscow, for example, and with the same routes. Well, why would the Yakuts or the Buryats need Moscow? It's 5,000 to 7,000 kilometers away from them. What's the point of supporting it? In this sense, they can manage on their own, especially Yakutia, the republic. It's rich in diamonds. They just need access to the foreign market, especially since it's nearby with Alaska and the United States right there. They'll help at the very least to get Yakutian diamonds onto the market and push De Beers aside. So these mechanisms exist. They just need to be supported. So the Verkhovna Rada some years ago recognized the government in exile of Ingushetia. We have recognized Ingushetia as a republic. We have relations with this government. It is in this manner that we need to launch mechanisms to dismantle the Russian Empire, to break up this prison of nations. We need to support those resistance forces, those peoples who are trying to break free from Moscow's oppression. Well, naturally, these are people who care, who will help both themselves on the one hand and us to accomplish this task. So, without a doubt, it is the concerned individuals who have contributed here. Many thanks to them.
Yes, Roman Igorovich, everything you've just said confirms that we've been attacking Moscow and the Moscow region for 5 days now. That is what we're talking about. Dubna, other regions, the CHP plant, the Moscow suburbs. All of this is the result of attacks by Ukraine's armed forces and special operations units. Roman Igorovich, what is being reported now? Regarding the attacks by additional drones on the CHP plants, in Oryol, they hit the CHP plant. In Yaroslavl, they hit the oil refinery. In Vladimir, the substation. There are blackouts there, no electricity, no heat, no water. Let's start with Oryol because the situation there is currently the most severe.
They have heavy ones, of course, Roman.
Ilyich, we're talking here, naturally, yes, just to be clear, we're having a conversation, Ilyich, and well, naturally, yes.
They've reached Oryol, reached our drone. We have long-range strike capabilities, the same fierce ones, the An-196. That's our main one right now. There are also several more, up to a dozen different types of long-range strike systems, and Oryol is one of them. Well, again, Oryol, this is exactly one of the technological corridors that supply Moscow. Look at the Oryol region, that's the direction. It's from this direction that Moscow gets its supply. Naturally, the destruction of everything related to energy, including gas, oil, and of course, stations and power generation, energy generation itself. The more of them you take out, the more you stop or disrupt the technological cycle, the fewer options there will be. Moscow will have left. To redistribute the electricity it has, which it receives in various ways, here it's important. Right now, attention should, of course, be paid to the gas pipeline because Moscow has several dozen gas generators. That is, they can produce energy themselves within the ring, the Moscow ring, inside the city. And these gas generators are powered by gas. Of course, by cutting off the gas supply, you can stop generation inside Moscow. That is, at least the emergency generators that are powered this way. Military facilities in the purest sense can also be shut down in this way, including military sites, and naturally the level of Oryol as well, or like today, at least in 3 cases. The strike targeted exactly these 3 mechanisms: the substation, the thermal power plant, that is, again, heat and electricity, and the oil refinery. That is, oil refining, of course, makes it possible for Moscow itself to be supplied with fuel, gasoline, diesel, and fuel oil on fuel oil. By the way, there is also generation there, so it's important to target this sector as well, or rather to keep targeting it, to keep hitting it. We're already doing this for the 3rd month now.
Roman Legovich Malak said that since the beginning of the year, the SBU has carried out more than 160 successful strikes on Russian oil extraction facilities. According to him, the SBU is striking only legitimate targets, which currently make up 90% of the budget of the Russian Ministry of Defense. If we look at the statistics for September and October of this year, that's 20 facilities, 6 refineries, 2 oil terminals, 3 oil depots, and 9 oil pumping stations, according to the SBU. The destruction of these facilities has led to a 20% shortage of petroleum products, as well as a ban on gasoline exports until the end of the year. What do you think?
Well, the security service of Ukraine has basically been working on destroying the Russian economy for 3 years now. Last year, the SBU operatives started together with the GUR, although as a pair. They began targeting the Russian oil and gas sector. They did a great job, so great, in fact, that they were stopped in May. And as for the one who stopped the SBU in May, they should have their arms twisted to the fullest extent possible. Why? Because if the SBU's work hadn't been stopped last year, then now Maliuk would be reporting a total blackout across all of Russia, or at least the European part of the Russian Empire. It's possible to do this, but you have to direct your actions accordingly. The security service, again, was stopped last May. This year, they started working again. They started working well. They managed to knock out almost 15% of the Russian oil industry right from the start. Then again, they were stopped in May. But the police were jumping out of their skins, telling everyone that apparently our office hustlers came up with such security measures for the Russian oil industry that even the Americans were stunned by these proposals. And they stopped Maliuk's work. Now, it's unclear why Maliuk didn't arrest those who stopped him back in March. In August, they started again. The security service has now been working for 3 months. Well, the effect is overwhelming, truly overwhelming. Why? Because, first of all, they're working from their own base. You have to understand what the security service is. It's their own base, a small base. That is by base, I mean the service itself. It's a special service. It's not the armed forces of Ukraine. It's not the Air Force. It's not the Navy. It's a special service that managed to set things up on its own base. First of all, they gathered professionals, a very smart approach, by the way. They started by bringing together real professionals, not just talkers from Firepoint, but actual experts who, first of all, if we talk about the aviation component, managed to get a fairly large fleet up and running, a wide range of strike capabilities. Secondly, the same thing happened at sea. They started operating there as well. Cyberby, everyone knows about them, and now there are already several positions there. There are new CBB models that operate as MLRs, air defense missile systems, and other anti-aircraft missile complexes. It's a whole lineup of drones that have been produced based on, or rather on the relatively small base of this special service. In other words, they have their own internal funding and naturally their own special department. This is a professional approach. There's a similar approach in the main intelligence directorate, though perhaps a bit less so, since the service itself is somewhat smaller in this regard. There's a similar approach now, for example, in the armed forces of Ukraine, in the drone forces, in the special operations forces, in the Air Force, and in the Navy. So it's roughly the same, but at least there they have direct government funding. And of course, the scale is much larger. They can push all of this through. So the security service has delivered results in just 3 months. It took out a fifth of Russia's oil industry. And if they hadn't touched it since last year, in a year and a half, Russia simply wouldn't have any oil industry left. That's what I'm talking about. So here, Maliuk needs to be shown what he needs to do. Right now, he needs to arrest people under Article 111 for treason, those who didn't let him work last year and this year, so that, God forbid, no one stops this third attempt. Because if they do stop it, then all of them should be lined up against the wall. Why? Because there is a chance to win. I've said it so many times, we need to change the defeatist paradigm to a victorious one. That is, ahead of us, we have the opportunity, with the help of Maliuk, well, to put it bluntly, the security service of Ukraine and similar special services, to simply bluntly put a cross on the Russian economy within a year or a year and a half. So by the end of next year, Russians simply won't have an economy anymore. And there won't be a state because of this, because that's exactly why the Soviet Union collapsed back in the day, and Russia will collapse the same way. And the army is a derivative of the state. No state, no army. And we won't have to chase those 700,000 sickly, half-dead guys across the Donetsk steppes, drowning them in the Sea of Azov. They'll scatter on their own. This approach is very important, and it's quite telling, so to speak. There's no need to theorize about anything here. It's clearly visible, and here are the numbers that show it. And war is mathematics. All of this is good. It can be calculated.
Roman Igorovich, Maliuk also said that Russian panzer systems work best against Ukrainian drones. That's why, since the beginning of 2025, Ukraine has destroyed 48% of them. Russians can produce about 30 units per year, but the number of destroyed SAM systems is significantly higher.
First of all, why is it higher? Indeed, first of all, that's the situation right now. At the moment, it is one of the most mass-produced, the most widely produced surface-to-air missile system. It has proven itself very well. In this sense, Maliuk is right. It's an army-level short-range SAM system. The first SAM system had 12 missiles. Now, SAM systems of this level, like the Pantsir, now it carries 48 missiles. That is, they cover a range of up to 20 kilometers. And that's enough, for example, to provide point defense for a particular facility. Practically, the missile saturation coefficient used to be 12, now it's 48. So, at a minimum, to break through a single Pantsir, you need to send more than 50 drones or missiles at it from one direction. The Pantsir is a good system. It's a good Russian SAM system. At first, it didn't perform well. Why? Because it took a long time to fine-tune it, especially the radar. There were issues with the radar, with tracking, and with the missiles themselves. But then, as a result of combat operations, and because we, the Russians, lost a lot of them after receiving what you might call a magic kick, they finally got it right. For us now, it's quite a serious obstacle when carrying out combat missions using the aviation component. They're dangerous not only for drones. The Pantsir is also a threat to cruise missiles, airplanes, and helicopters. If, for example, it covers even the beginning of a Russian mechanized column or some object in the rear, for instance. That's why it's not enough to just destroy the Pantsers themselves, although that's a given. Pantsers, there's no question about that. By the way, for the security service, for the GUAR, for the SSO, who can operate in the enemy's rear, this is one of the main targets at the moment. It's also necessary to destroy the means of production. That is, the factories that manufacture these Pantsirs, the design bureaus, and the plants that produce their components and assemblies. For this Pantsir, it means we need long-range strike capabilities. That's why we're waiting for our missiles, preferably ballistic ones. Why? Because cruise missiles, the Pantsir will just shoot them down. But Pantsir can't handle ballistic missiles.
Roman Olegovich regarding Yaroslavl Nefteyoxintes, that is, the oil refinery, we attacked it last night. A series of explosions occurred in the area of the Yaroslavl Slavneft Yanos refinery.
The oil refinery obviously is not very large, no question about that. It falls a bit below into the mid-range category, but it also serves as a base for petrochemical production. So it's not just a pure oil refinery. It's already what you would call a petrochemical plant. In other words, it has a wide range of products. If it ends up being destroyed, it's one of the plants currently in line to be targeted by our long-range strike capabilities. And it's also waiting for the same Pantsir air defense system, which our special services are currently destroying quite effectively. I don't think it will ever get that Pantsir. A single strike, of course, is not enough. To completely stop the technological cycle, you need to repeat it at least once and then thin it out about once a quarter. So we will be hearing about this oil refinery more than once. The only thing that could put an end to it for good is ballistic missiles. About 3 or 4 ballistic missiles with half-ton warheads would shut it down forever. And no one will ever know where its grave is. Well, there's no other way.
The Flamingo missile has been used 9 times in real operations. It is the best Ukrainian missile currently in existence, reports Le Figaro, citing the words of President Zelensky behind closed doors and Firepoint's chief technical officer, Irina Terek. Roman Egorovich, what do you have to say?
Well, so the secret behind Firepoint's flashy bravado has been revealed. Why do I say that? Because with these little announcements, Firepoint, to be honest, has created a really negative image for itself. Why? Because it was announced that these missiles had already gone into mass production, supposedly by the hundreds being stockpiled somewhere, supposedly ready to be launched somewhere. But in reality, if there are 9 missiles, that I can believe. So the claim that there were 100 missiles in production or in a production run, I don't buy that. Why? Because, well, they would already be in use by now. But 9 missiles, that's possible. That's exactly a pre-production batch. Any pre-production batch is 10 missiles. If 10 missiles have completed a combat mission and performed well or excellently, then basically that missile can be accepted for production and put into mass manufacturing. So if the 10th strike by this missile also shows positive results, then we can say that it can already be put into service and launched. This missile is easy to manufacture, really easy. We've been talking with you for several years and about the AI-25TL. I have 1,500 flight hours on it, and on the L-39, these engines were installed. We used to manufacture them in Zaporizhia, and thousands of these engines were produced. They were removed from aircraft after reaching the end of their service life and are now just gathering dust. Engines that are still in use on aircraft definitely won't be left to gather dust in the warehouses of technical maintenance units. There are a lot of them, thousands, just sitting there gathering dust. They can be made operational in just one flight, so to speak. That is, you can mount them on the wing together with this missile and send them off. You can push the missile along. In principle, this engine can run for hours. In fact, it can operate for hours at nominal mode and with very low fuel consumption, because the range of this missile will only be limited by the amount of fuel it can carry on board. So this is a lightweight missile. In terms of production, it's at the level of the V1, which will soon be 100 years old. And in principle, it could have been put into mass production a long time ago. For 6 years now, this is the 7th year, the authorities have been dragging their feet, doing nothing. And in reality, of course, the missile still isn't in serial production. Eventually, we'll see it appear someday. Maybe not this year, maybe next year. They could be put into production, well, maybe not hundreds, but realistically, you could make 1 or 2 missiles a day. So roughly, you could get up to about 50 missiles a month and create a single wave, a pretty serious wave with these missiles at some significant targets. Because if the warhead weighs a ton and the range is 3,000 kilometers, then you can start preparing for the Yamal Cross and the Omsk oil refinery. Of course, not all 10 or even all 100 missiles will make it. Most of them will be shot down. This needs to be clearly understood. A missile like this is a very good aerial target for everything, from mobile groups to fighter jets, not to mention the Panzer air defense systems. But the Russian air defense system can be overwhelmed by exceeding its interception coefficient. Roughly speaking, the Panzer can shoot down either 12 targets at once or 48 targets. So if you send 100 missiles at it, it will shoot down 48 and 52 will get through. So in this mode, you can accomplish combat missions. We wait. Well, once again, announcements, more announcements, announcements of what? Of the fact that 9 missiles were launched somewhere. Where are the hundreds of missiles? So where is the mass production? That's the whole point. And if you haven't put these missiles into mass production, then at least don't blabber on air. I'm saying this to our green profiteers. Don't blabber on air, at least not until you've accomplished this task. And about the fact that hundreds of missiles are entering Russian territory, no, we shouldn't be talking about that. But in the end, we need to come back down from the theatrical stage. Return to the war. In other words, we're in combat operations talking about missile production, about the production of strike weapons. Never does the side that produces and uses them talk about it before they are used on a massive scale. What for? For one simple reason. So the enemy doesn't find out where they're being produced and stored. And so a Kinjal or Iskander missile doesn't hit them. That's why everyone keeps quiet. But when people start blabbing like market women, especially on air, it ends badly. I'll say it again. This isn't a stage. It's not theater. This is war. And in war, it's not the rules of the stage that should apply, but combat rules, military laws. And here, maintaining secrecy should be the top priority. At least that's the main task when producing this kind of weaponry.